Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So I'm posting this on a Thursday, which is normally when I post my interviews, but I purposefully do not have an interview for you this week. And it is because of a few things. I want to actually get into the meat of what I want to say, which is an actual part of a video. I'm talking about storytelling, but I want to do a channel update first. First thing being that I'm probably going to dial back a little bit on the interviews for a little bit. The reason for that is multifaceted. Number one being summer is coming up just around the bend, and I'm not going to lie to you. I spend most of my free time in the summer either at the beach or in my garden. So trying to connect with other people who are doing the same thing on a schedule where I already have a lot of tight deadlines to hit and things like that is a little bit hard to do. So I may replace it in the summer with either live streams or short videos that I will be doing during the week. The other thing being that the reason why I started these interviews to begin with was, if you remember correctly, if you saw that video of mine, was to grow my channel, and it does not seem to have grown my channel in any significant way. Now, I really like doing these interviews, and I'm getting a lot of information that I normally would not get, so I want to continue with them in some fashion, but it may not be the mainstay of my weekday videos for very much longer, although, as I said, I will probably continue to do them. And I have 3 paths open to me, and I just want to throw this out there so you can all put a comment in the comments if you have a direction for me. Number one, I can either do shorter videos during the week, which is because YouTube really wants me to post shorter videos, which will be a short topic somewhere between 5 and 15 minutes for me. Alternatively, I could just do live streams during the week at some point, or because the entire reason I want to grow my channel more is so that people will know about my writing, I could simply go back to 1 video a week, posting other things only randomly, and concentrate on writing. I really want to do more on the writing scale because I'm going to put out at the very least 2 graphic novels per year, but there's other things I want to do as well. I have several stories now being written, one which I want to post as a web comic, probably on my Subscribestar, although Arkhaven, which is a large online comic publisher, which I think Chuck Dixon posts a lot of stuff there as well, online comics. I have another story getting ready, which I might try to get published via Alterna Comics, and a third one as well, which I'm going to try to get published as if it were a manga, using actual manga artists and manga format, etc. Which, again, if that does well, I'll probably take my unpublished novel manuscript and publish it in manga format. Anyway, if you listened to all that, thank you very much. And if you want to give me some direction, you go right ahead. Put that in the comments. I'd love to hear what my audience wants more of and what direction you think I should go in. That's why I'm doing this spiel to begin with. I want to hear what you have to say. And of course, just briefly, before I get into my actual topic, you have been looking at some of the art from my beautiful graphic novels in the background and my upcoming graphic novel. The links for those are all in the description. So last week I did a video where I talked about a couple of podcasts that I ran across. One was from Marvel.com itself, from Marvel Voices. And I was talking about how diversity is a weakness, not a strength. But there was a part of it which actually fed into a lot of what I've been talking about concerning storytelling. And I want to go over that very small part of that podcast right now, because I think it explains a lot of questions a lot of us comic YouTubers and Comicsgate people have had about why certain people get hired and why they write stories in the way that they do. And of course, as I always say, I think the comic industry is just a microcosm. It's probably this way within other entertainment industries as well. So you can apply this to your gaming industry, to novels, to anything else really that I think is connected to science fiction and fantasy. So if you didn't hear my last video, the first podcast that I talked about, as I said, was from Marvel.com. It was about a man called John Michael Innes, and his official title is Director of Talent Relations and Publishing Recruitment, which is a big old long way of just saying that he's a diversity consultant, diversity and inclusion. He puts diversity and inclusion into the hiring practices. And he said something which I personally would take to be part of the bigotry of low expectations, the low expectations for anyone who is basically not white. But what he said was that marginalized communities, and specifically he talked about the Black community, although he was including other persons of color there as well, but he was also including the alphabet people in there as well. He was saying that marginalized communities do not come to comics by the same way that normal comic fans come to comics. He said that these marginalized communities simply don't have the resources to actually buy comics. Why? Because they either live in a place where there isn't a comic shop, or they simply don't have the money to buy comics. Why? Well, I think it's an unanswered, unstated assumption of his that, of course, these people are oppressed, therefore they're poor, therefore they don't have money to spend on extras. Nonetheless, he continues by saying that these marginalized communities come to comics, and oh, by the way, although this man does work for several different sections of Marvel at once, working not only with the comics, but also with video games and adjacent to the movies and television, but he was saying that these marginalized communities come to comics by way of the television set. And even though he specifically acknowledges and states that the Marvel comics are the beating heart of Marvel, and he is hiring people specifically for Marvel comics and then curating their experience there as well, he thinks that these marginalized communities that he's looking for as a diversity and inclusion officer don't come to comics by way of comics, they come to comics by way of the television set. And this answers a question, really, I think it might have been an unasked question, but I've certainly implied it many of times, and other comic YouTubers have as well. I've heard Richard Meyer ask the same question over at Comics Matter. But the question being, why in the world would you be hiring all of these people who don't know anything about comics? You listen to their interviews and they say, oh, I got into Marvel by watching the X-Men show in the 90s. Congratulations, you were a kid in North America with a television in the 90s. That's no big accomplishment. I've listened to so many other women on the Women of Marvel podcast talk about how they got into comics by reading Archie, or they read Calvin and Hobbes in the paper. That's how they got into comics. You see, none of these things are actually comics. So why in the world would you go and hire these people who knew nothing about comics until they get hired by Marvel Comics? That seems like an absurd thing to do. Well, of course, first of all, as I've covered in older videos, one of the reasons why is because you don't actually want to hire people who are fans of your product, because then they might actually speak up when you start to destroy it. And I'm not pulling that out of my hat. I had several people point me towards podcasts that were done by people who worked on the new Star Trek shows saying this exact thing, that they had to specifically hide the fact that they were Star Trek fans in order to get to work on these shows, because they never would have gotten hired to begin with if the producers had known that. Or I guess the hiring underlings of the producers had known that. So again, how does he then go and look for these people if they're not actually comic fans, or they're only comic adjacent fans? How does he go and look for those people to hire for Marvel Comics? Well, he says he goes out into the marginalized parts of the community. Some of those he explains as being these Comic-Cons, and I put that in quotation marks, that aren't actually Comic-Cons at their heart. They're a diversity and inclusion kind of meeting of a certain group of people, which then share some kind of connection to comics. And if you're on Twitter, you probably see this a whole lot. You'll see advertisements for a Comic-Con that is centered around people of color, or Black people specifically, and it's that part of their identity that comes first, and then the comics come second. Also, there are plenty of that kind of Comic-Con centered around your alphabet people, saying alphabet people thing comes first, then the comics come second. So he goes out to these kinds of cons instead of the actual, Comic-Cons, which are supposed to be, and I do stress that, supposed to be centered around comics first and other things second. No, he goes out to these places to look for people out there. Now that's number one. But number two is the fact that he quite specifically says that because these marginalized communities don't come to comics through comics, they come to it via the television set. This, as he says, changes the way that they relate to characters and to the stories. Now, I cannot stress that point enough, because this affects the entire way that comics, and really other mediums of entertainment, are made as well. It's not going to be the exact same, but you can apply the same thing to it. If you have someone who's creating D&D properties who has never really played D&D, then you got yourself a problem. If you have someone writing scripts for video games who never actually really played video games, then you got yourself a problem. But the way that this problem expresses itself in comics, I've been going on and on about for quite some time, asking questions about why do people do these things? They're absurd. Now I have the answer. Again, this is one of Richard's nagging questions that he asks over and over again. He's saying, why do these people write a comic and produce a comic that looks like a Netflix pitch? He's saying, well, they want to get a Netflix deal out of the entire thing. And I would say, yeah, that's part of it. That's probably the main part of it. But the secondary part of all of that, and I would say the underlying part, is that they're producing something that looks like a television show because that's how they came to these characters and these stories. That's how he, quite specifically, the guy who's doing this podcast, says that they relate to those characters and stories in this specific way. They don't know how a comic book works. They don't know how the visuals and the storytelling are put together. They're just replacing all of that with how a television or a movie works. And I know that this is something that has run through comics a long time. I remember just picking up some old Legion of Superheroes and reading them about a year ago, and they were from, I think, the late 70s, and they were in outer space, and there was an enemy spacecraft, and I turned the page and looked at it, and it was almost a copy of the USS Enterprise, and I went, oh, that's just cringe. It's the exact same thing I did a couple of years ago when I was reading Immortal Hulk, and they had these little creatures which were obviously ripoffs of the facehuggers from Aliens. So yeah, comics does this a lot. But number one, it never really works out for them. The only time I think it ever actually worked out at all was when they took the aliens from Alien and put them into the Brood, which was an X-Men villain. That actually worked when they held onto it and made it its own separate thing. But usually this thing just falls flat. And number two, the funny thing is that right now you'll see that old Legion of Superhero comic, it was sticking in something that people would actually know about and say, yeah, that's the Enterprise, obviously. Why? Because it was popular when they were actually writing the comic. But now you get these people writing comics and doing the art for comics, and they're using properties from 40 years ago to copy off of. So it doesn't have the same cultural impact in any way. Secondly, this confirms something which I go on about a fair bit. When I listened to that interview with Marika Tamaki and did a video about it a couple of years ago, she talked about how people are basically reflections of the things that they see around them. And so your story that you're going to create, because she's a writer for Marvel and DC, that story can take all of these realities that you are exposed to and that you mimic and just put them down on a page. But there's no distinction between actual reality and fantasy or fiction in any way. That is to say, you go ahead and take things off of the television, off of the movie screen, and slap it down there on the page as if it was your own experience, equal to your own experience, because they're exactly the same in her estimation, because they're all just a mimicry of something you see anyways. And thirdly, I think this is one of the reasons why comics specifically look so awful. The first part of that being, I'm always going on about the wretched colors that they use in modern comics. Why? Because these people are trying to imitate what they see on the television screen. That doesn't work on a page. Number two, they don't have any idea of how to tell a story according to sequential art. This is something that Graham Nolan talked to me about when I did an interview with him, and when Graham Nolan actually interviewed John Romita Jr., this was almost the heart of what their entire conversation was about. It was about good sequential storytelling. How you bring a 2D picture into a 3D image in the mind of the reader and then use that to convey movement from one still panel to the next. This is an art in itself. John Romita Jr. talks about that for a while. He's saying, yeah, my art is not good. I realize that. But what I try to do is to become a better and better visual storyteller in how I move from panel to panel. But again, if you're getting people to work for Marvel Comics who specifically weren't Marvel fans, and really some of them have never picked up a comic before, you're not going to get people who understand the dynamic of visual storytelling and sequential art via visual storytelling. And I don't care if they're writers or not. If you are going to write a script so that your artist can actually interpret it and put down some good visual storytelling, you need to know those things. But they don't know those things because they're taking their cue from an entirely different visual medium, which is television and movies. So yeah, I just wanted to get that off my chest because I think that that was something which I couldn't stick into my last video, but really had to be covered. And shows that once again, we can take all of the horrible comics that we see around us today and for the last 10 to 15 years and not excuse them as being just artists trying to learn how to do something new, or new people coming in to try to tell stories in a different way. Because, oh, by the way, Sana Amanat said that in 2000, and I think it was 9, she said that she was brought on to completely change the way that comics were made, and I think this is a part of it. But no, it's not growing pains in order for these new people to actually learn how to do these things. No, they don't need to learn how to do these things. They don't want to learn how to do these things. That is to say, tell a good comic story, either visually or through the words, because that's not what kind of story they're telling. That's not what kind of story they're used to. And all of this idiocy can be laid, once again, squarely at the feet of the fact that these people have no real skill in telling a comic story because they're just diversity hires. So, if I've given you anything new to think about in this short video, and yes, this is what I consider a short video, then leave me a comment. And as I said, leave me some comments about where you want my channel to go in the future. I might even get people saying that, yeah, you should do these shorter videos during the weekend instead of the long ones that I usually do. And of course, quick reminder that the links for my graphic novels are in the description, both for The Valiant Heroes and Thomas Valiant, which are my superhero graphic novels, and the upcoming graphic novel, which is CROM the Destroyer. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later. Bye.